Hello and welcome back to the show. Today, we are going to be discussing the recent research paper that I actually sent out in the Research Spotlight emails. So every month, on the first of the month, this was September's, I send out basically an email that highlights a piece of research that I like, that I want to share with you, and I go over it with basically like what it did, what the outcomes were, and what that actually means in terms of like application, or maybe not what it means, but what it means for me and what I would do with this information, why I found it super helpful. So if you don't get the emails and you don't like reading, because I know a lot of you, like a lot of people prefer to like learn in different ways. So if you don't like the emails, I'm going to do like the podcast version, or I guess this is also a YouTube video. So it's either YouTube or podcast that you can then listen to or watch instead of reading. And if you missed out on that email or it got lost in your inbox, then you can always come back and listen to this. And it basically just starts to build a really cool amount of research and evidence, as well as like practical application as part of my show, which is the goal. So I have the research paper here right in front of me, which if you can see on YouTube, this is where it is. I have it printed out because I like to print and highlight. I like to write notes. I also like to write definitions of words on the page when I find something I've never actually heard of before. My vocabulary is pretty basic because I was never very good at English at school, and I never got into like the really formal ways of writing. So sometimes I don't know what I'm reading and I have to research it and look it up. So there's a lot of like writing on these research papers that help me really identify further things. So anyway, we're going to be discussing that. Now, this was September's email. So it went out on the 1st of September, and I had quite a good bit of feedback from this one. Everyone liked it. So hopefully you enjoy this. And if you have already read the email and you're listening to this again, hopefully something new comes about from this. But basically, we're talking about the research paper title is actually titled, "Can Women Correctly Contract Their Pelvic Floor Muscles Without Formal Instruction?" So this is so relevant for us as non-internal physiotherapists or practitioners. So obviously being an exercise physiologist, we do none of this assessment type of stuff. And I definitely do not do internal examinations on pelvic floors. And I'm also online, which means I can't even palpate externally core work, muscle activation, or anything like that. So for me, understanding the role that verbal cueing plays and its ability to actually get clients to contract properly is so important. So when I read this paper, I was like, this is so relevant for me, because like if I'm cueing someone online and I can't confirm what they're doing, you know, myself palpating and sort of feeling maybe what's going on through like abdominal wall or through glutes or through hips or whatever that might be, this is going to help me really understand maybe who needs a little bit more help, whether or not it's actually correct, and maybe other ways to cue things. So we're going to talk about this. Obviously, if you're also an EP or if you're a fitness professional and you're thinking about like, how can you also verbally cue pelvic floor, and if this is actually going to help your clients and is it working, this is also going to be helpful for you. So in terms of the reference, I'm going to chuck that in the show notes, because if you want to look that up, you can have a little bit of a look yourself and read the whole paper if you want to. However, I'm going to basically go through the nitty-gritty of what they actually did. So let's start by like the goal of this paper, really. Let's talk about the goal of this paper. I'm going to read this from the actual objectives. So quote, in direct quotes, "We sought to describe the proportion of women who initially incorrectly contract the pelvic floor muscle and how many can learn after basic instruction." So this was performed as a cross-sectional study. And basically what they did was every woman that came in for their annual checkup were basically asked to be part of the study. And they basically had like a pelvic examination where they were put into a particular group. So those 4 groups basically consisted of the first group was pelvic organ prolapse with no stress incontinence. The second group was stress incontinence and no pelvic organ prolapse. The third group had both pelvic organ prolapse and stress urinary incontinence. And the fourth group had neither. So they were nil to prolapse and nil to urinary incontinence. So there was 4 groups of people. So basically they came in, they got assessed, whatever they had, they popped into one of those groups. So in total inside the study, there were 779 women, which is like a massive number. I was quite shocked. I'm like used to reading papers where they're performed on like 10 people. And you're like, how is this so helpful? Like 10 people, what's the likelihood of this actually being relevant in the real world? Anyway, 779 is pretty good. So in terms of how those numbers looked in each group, the pelvic organ prolapse group had 166 women in it. The stress incontinence group that had no pelvic organ prolapse was 133. The both category, so they had pelvic organ prolapse and stress incontinence, that was 35 out of the 779, and neither pelvic organ prolapse or stress incontinence group was actually 445. So that was probably the biggest group. Well, it's the biggest group, but it's quite a big significant difference. The next group would have been the prolapse group, which was 166. So anyway, so they were all basically assessed, and initially they were assessed with a particular cue that was in brackets. This is what they said. Now, please squeeze the muscles in the vagina and hold like you are holding urine. So that was basically their first initial cue to do a pelvic floor contraction. And there was an examiner who was actually palpating internally at the time, and a correct activation of the pelvic floor was determined by inward pressure or upward traction felt on the fingers of the examiner, as well as no accompanying contraction through the glutes or no valsalva. So basically it was like isolated pelvic floor, and it was determined by whether they could contract or provide inward pressure and or upward traction. So that was sort of like that is the correct activation guideline, let's say. So in terms of the results after that first assessment, so on the first assessment, they were basically, did these people do it properly or not? So 85.5% of the prolapse group were successful. So 85% of those women were like, yep, they did their pelvic floor activation correctly. 83.4% of the stress incontinence group were successful. 68.6% of both stress incontinence and prolapse were successful, and 85.8% of the neither group were successful. So technically, if you have pelvic organ prolapse and stress incontinence, you're definitely less likely to contract your pelvic floor well on your first attempt with that cue. However, approximately the other groups were pretty much like between 83 and 85% successful, which I think is so cool. So like they were just basically told, and the likelihood of someone to contract their pelvic floor without, but what was the cue? The cue was, sorry, I've got notes on my screen. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you can see them, I'm scrolling up through my notes. But the first cue was, please squeeze the muscles in the vagina and hold like you are holding urine. So that was basically like correctly cued, correctly activation. So anyway, not too bad. Not so great for the prolapse and stress incontinence group, but that's okay. So a total of 120 women out of that group, out of like 779, were unsuccessful at contracting their pelvic floor with that verbal cue. So they failed the test, incorrectly contracted their pelvic floor. And that might have been like accompanying glute squeeze. It could have been like valsalva maneuver, but they could have maybe had inward and upward contraction of the pelvic floor. We don't know. But it could also be like maybe they didn't even contract their pelvic floor well at all. So they just did it wrong. So they basically then reassessed these women. And this time they have a second cue, which was, please relax. Now I want you to use your vaginal muscles instead of your bottom muscles. So it must have been like they must have used their glutes to squeeze this as well. That must have been pretty much the main problem. Now, this cue alone resulted in 94 out of that 120 women correctly contracting the pelvic floor after that instruction. So all they needed to hear was the second verbal cue of do it again, but don't use your butt. And they were successful at it, which I think is so awesome. Like really, really cool. The women, though, with the prolapse were the least likely group of women to improve their ability to correctly contract the pelvic floor after that cue, in comparison to those who didn't have pelvic organ prolapse or stress incontinence, which sucks a little bit for them, but it's good to know. It's good to know that the prolapse population are probably going to be those ones that need a little bit more support, especially if they've got stress incontinence, because they're the ones that are least likely to do it properly on the first contraction. So we need to keep that in mind as clinicians or practitioners or fitness professionals, whatever that might be. So I think this is a pretty cool study. It just goes to show that if we just correctly cue the pelvic floor or just cue it in general, for the average population, it is quite likely that they're going to do it correctly initially. And if not, then we may need to like give them professional support. But if there's a couple of different variations in cues, then we can maybe even help them in other ways. So if we're thinking from this from like a practical perspective, like I have multiple cues of pelvic floor up my sleeve. I'm going to be using different types of cueing depending on what resonates really well with clients and what doesn't. So if you only have one and that fails, then that's not ideal. You want a couple so you can correctly cue again and see what happens. But the funny thing about this, actually, which I really think is so funny, well, I mean, it's not very funny, but part of it is, the study actually accounted for other variables as well. So they took into consideration age, BMI, ethnicity, education level, parity, type of delivery, menopausal status, HRT use, chronic cough history, smoking status, caffeine intake, previous hysterectomies, and health status. And the only associations that they actually found with incorrect pelvic floor muscle contraction were the increase in vaginal deliveries and decreased caffeine intake. Can I just repeat that? Decreased caffeine intake. So basically, those who consumed more caffeine were actually more likely to contract their pelvic floor, well, properly, which is such a bizarre association. I mean, I thought about this and I think it's just like a coincidence personally, but the study actually sort of extrapolated and thought like, you know, why is this happening? Why is this a thing? And they basically boiled it down to the fact that those who drink more caffeine have trained themselves to engage their pelvic floor muscles better through the diuretic effect of these drinks and therefore conditioned themselves to correctly utilize their pelvic floor. So, I mean, if you've got a coffee poop coming along, you got to hold it in, right? So I guess that was my theory, was like, oh, pelvic floor work might improve and they might get better at holding their pelvic floor if they drink more coffee because they have coffee poops. I mean, I don't really know. That was just my thoughts, but I thought that was quite funny in a sense of the research, and like the seriousness of reading it was also like, they've actually been like, man, we need an explanation about why there is an association with caffeine and pelvic floor contraction. So I thought that was quite funny. I hope you think it's hilarious as much as I did. But anyway, key takeaways from this whole paper. Number one is that exercise physiologists or any health and fitness professional really can actually verbally cue clients to contract the pelvic floor. And there's pretty highly likely chance that they're actually going to be doing it correctly. And that's regardless of what's going on for them. You know, except for maybe considering the stress incontinence and the prolapse group might need a bit more support, but most of the time they're going to do it pretty well. And if you can instruct and refine your cueing really well and be a little bit more maybe aware of the different types of, I guess, compensation patterns that might happen, like the Valsalva or the glute squeezing contraction when that happens, then you can be able to identify when someone might actually not be contracting their pelvic floor very well. So that was like the second point. Second point is like, there are going to be strategies that indicate poor pelvic floor contraction, like glutes contractions and breath holding. This is something that I see all the time, and I use this a lot in my virtual clinic in assessing people. Like, what are they doing outside of their pelvic floor? Because obviously I can't see the pelvic floor, but I can see like what their abdominal wall looks like. I can see what their breathing pattern looks like. I can see other types of movements happening. Like if you're seeing movement on a pelvic floor squeeze somewhere else, that's probably a pretty good indicator that something is actually jumping on board, because the pelvic floor is pretty small and it's internal, and you probably shouldn't really see too much muscle activation. We shouldn't really see much movement really at all when they're contracting. So yeah, there's going to be other pelvic floor compensation patterns, I guess we could call them, strategies for contraction. So that's something else that we can take in to consideration. So it's a pretty big sign that they're not doing it very well. So look out for that. The third point was that those who have stress, incontinence, and prolapse may actually struggle to learn to correctly contract through their pelvic floor and might need a lot more cueing, or they might need a lot more support from maybe an internal therapist where they can identify it a little bit more. But it might give you some insight into maybe why someone's pelvic floor isn't or maybe their symptoms aren't changing and they don't feel strong after you've, given them exercises for a couple of weeks and you've seen no changes, that they might not be really doing it that well and they might actually need that internal examination. So I believe there is a place for all practitioners to be part of pelvic floor rehabilitation. Not everybody is going to need an internal examination, nor do they want one, which is exactly why I offer the service that I do. And maybe they don't have access to one either, but there are going to be some cases where you're going to really need to refer out. And this could be one of them. Prolapse and stress urinary incontinence. Both of them together, pretty big red flag that they might really struggle. So also pretty good place to tell them that it could be difficult, but it will get better once they learn how to correctly connect with that. So that's point number 3. And point number 4 is that those who have multiple vaginal deliveries are less likely to contract their pelvic floor correctly initially. So there's that association. And obviously less caffeine intake also still really blows my mind. But less caffeine intake could also indicate that. I mean, maybe I should start adding that to my screening form. How many coffees or caffeinated drinks do you have? And if they have none, that might be a red flag that they don't contract their pelvic floor. Well, haven't actually put that in my screening form, and I don't actually ask that question, but I'm now thinking about doing that, all thanks to reading this paper. But yeah, those are the associations. So there's no other association according to this paper, which I think is pretty strange, to be honest. But yeah, multiple vaginal deliveries and less caffeine intake. So keep your eyes out for that. Now, in regard to like the overall theme of this paper, I think it is so nice to read that, like I was always told, you have to refer out for internal pelvic floor physiotherapy so you know what's going on every time. And I would always really push this. And like, I'm all for multiple practitioners and internal examinations and physiotherapists and collaboration between exercise physios and osteos or myos or whoever else is involved in care. But there's always also a fear, especially for me being like a sole trader, that if I'm going to refer my client out to a pelvic floor physio for internal examination, that will my client come back? Like, is that person going to take the business? And this is from more of a business perspective rather than a practitioner perspective, because there's heaps of good pelvic floor physios that don't do this. But I have had a lot of bad experience previously with businesses or other practitioners then converting that client over to their group classes or their, I guess, rehabilitation rather than letting them to come back to me. So that's more of a business thing and a person thing rather than like the practitioner itself. But that's always been something that's blocked me from actually sending people away, is like, if I send them away, are they going to come back? Like they really wanted to do this, but I'm a bit nervous about that. And that probably just also boils down to the confidence level of my skills. But that was something that initially was a problem because I referred people out and I lost clients and I lost income. And that was a pretty big deal for me at the time. So I was like, man, like, can I just like queue these? Like, what's the likelihood of them actually doing it correctly anyway? I uptrained then in like pelvic floor assessment with, oh man, what is it called? Real-time ultrasound. The ultrasound machine, I was lucky to have access to one of those. So I did a bit of like extra study or extra learning around this. Was showed how to use that properly. And that was sort of really beneficial for me to see like lift of the pelvic floor, like under the bladder when they were doing their pelvic floor work. Like, I mean, you don't get the nitty-gritty of all the muscle contraction, but you can see the lift versus a bearing down. And I did notice that there are a lot of people, there were a lot of women who were actually bearing down instead of contracting up. And you can see that on the real-time ultrasound. And actually, now that I think about it, the 2 people that I remember that standing out for both had prolapse. And they actually, one of them had like fecal incontinence, and the other one also did have urinary incontinence, because most of them actually came for urinary incontinence back then. But this was also very early on in my career. My cueing wasn't that great. I probably didn't really know how to recognize core connection strategies back then either. So I think like looking back, it was just a combination of, you know, they probably would have been able to change it if they, you know, I'd cued better, but at the same time, the visual of them looking at the screen and seeing like the bladder move downwards versus like the bladder lift upwards in the real-time ultrasound was actually super helpful visual for them. So, you know, I did that at the time. But this paper in general, let's just get back to the paper, was really comforting for me because I do run a virtual clinic, and a lot of my clients are remote and rural, and they don't have access to women's health physiotherapy for internal examinations, or if they have, they've had to fly to locations, or they've had physiotherapy and internal work before already, and now they've sort of progressed over to more strength-based training, or they want something else because their symptoms haven't fully resolved, whatever it might be for each person. So initially, when I did start the virtual clinic, I was like, oh, how am I going to be able to do this online? But now, like, I don't really have many doubts about my skills. Most of the time, I'm pretty confident in them, to be quite honest. But at the same time, this is a really great like paper for me to like, oh, okay, the research does say that most women are pretty good at it if you can cue pretty well, or at least try a second time, and for them to know what it feels like. So one thing though that I think is really, really, really important is when you are cueing pelvic floor work, you have to be able to explain to them what it feels like to do it correctly and what it feels like for them to do it incorrectly. So that is something I do with every single client. And it's really important because if they do it wrong, they need to be able to identify that they're doing it wrong. Because if you send them home from their session with you and they're not correctly squeezing their pelvic floor and they have no idea what it feels like to do it wrong, this is when they're going to come back after 2 weeks and be like, oh, I was doing it like everything's gotten worse, or it's not getting any better. And it's probably because they've actually been doing it wrong this whole time. So I think that's another really important strategy to use, is like how you cue, but also how you teach them about what to feel and what it shouldn't and shouldn't feel like. That is something I've actually had to master online as a practitioner, not just in person, because in person you can see what they're doing and you can move them themselves and you can palpate and tell them, oh yeah, you're correctly contracting this muscle group or whatever it might be. And if you are a physio listening to this and you do internal work and you are just giving that feedback of, oh yeah, you're doing it really well, that's correct, then it's really hard for the person to then go, well, if I don't have that person telling me it's correct when I'm at home, then how do I know I'm doing it correctly? So I think if that's something that you don't currently do, I would highly suggest you add that into your practical application, because it is super helpful. I find a lot of my clients virtually now, because they do that, they get a lot better results a lot quicker, and they're super connected to their body, more so than when I was in person. I'd find like there were so many people just really disconnected from their own bodies and what they felt. Whereas I sort of haven't really had to navigate that problem. Initially, yes, but they get better pretty quickly. So anyway, so there you go. That is basically the paper that I wanted to discuss with you via this platform, that I sent out a sort of condensed version of that through the email. I honestly just really enjoy sharing this with you. I've really enjoyed writing it, and I've really enjoyed, I guess, rewriting it in a platform of like this, recording it, because I like to hear both things. I'm really conversational in the way I learn. I love to like chat with people and learn and ask questions and talk like a conversation, rather than super formal webinars and education seminars and things like that. So if you like that, like me, then hopefully this resonates really well with you. But that is the research paper for September, done and dusted, now in the platform here, so you can listen and watch back at any time you like. If you find this really helpful or you really enjoy these, I'd really like to ask if you could share this within your community, because I do this for you. I wouldn't be doing this if you weren't interested. Otherwise, I'd be listening to my own voice. Just do this. So my goal is to actually grow this a little bit more and create like a really cool community of like-minded professionals who are super interested in women's health, that love the research, that love the chit chat and conversation and connection. So if you think there's someone that might value this, please share that with them, whether it's you share it to them privately, whether you post this on any social media. Please tag me at what is it? I get confused. I get so confused with the underscore and the dot. At her.education_. Yeah, that's what it is. That's my education platform, Instagram. So if you could tag me in that, you can tag my at her.exercise.physiology as well. That would be super helpful. I mean, if you want to leave a review for the podcast, that would be awesome. That would help me too. Anything would be great. I'd really, really appreciate it. I appreciate that you're here, even listening and watching this. If you actually want to learn more about the pelvic floor, the mentorship program that I run is kicking off in January 2024. So I currently am finishing off this year's mentorship with 10 absolutely fantastic. They're all women. Everyone in there is a female. And they're so great. It's really, really awesome. They've learned so much. And I'm actually a little bit sad that it's coming to an end, but I only take 10 in each intake. So if you are interested in learning about that, it's a deep dive into the pelvic floor across the female life cycle. So we talk about pelvic floor anatomy and physiology. We dive into the deep depth of that. We look at how the posture plays a role in this. We look at pregnancy, postnatal recovery. We look at pelvic girdle pain. We look at menopause and hormonal status and how that plays a role in that too. We look at exercise prescription for basically all forms of pelvic floor dysfunction. So you get lots of examples of case studies. You get lots of like examples of programs as well that walk you through basically step-by-step programs that I've used for specific clients of mine. So it's such a practical component of like learning as well. Like I hate going to a webinar where you just learn all the statistics and you get like a couple of pointers, but you don't actually know how to prescribe the exercise. So my goal for the mentorship was to be like, here is the actual practical application. These are the exercises we do. So we actually go through like a whole database of exercise workshops, and we workshop every exercise, how to progress, where they'd fit into basically like a prescription plan, and what you would use them for. So there's heaps inside the mentorship. So if you are interested in doing that, it's a pretty solid commitment. It's the 6 months. We do a lot of content, but the waitlist is set up, ready to go. So you can join the waitlist. It's going to open up in December for a January intake. I've put the link to join the waitlist in the show notes. However, you can also head to my link in my bio on my her.education_ page and join the waitlist there too. So I would highly recommend you join that because 10 spots inside the mentorship program, and basically the waitlist gets first option. So if you're not on the waitlist, you will not get offered this position unless it doesn't fill from the waitlist. So I'll open it up then, but that will open December for a January intake. We kick off January, we go for 6 months. I mean, at this stage, we're doing 6 months, but there's support basically till the end of the year through group community stuff. So there'll be more information dropping for that in December or closer to December. But if you have any questions about that and you are interested in joining, please just shoot me over an email, or you can like Instagram message me, whatever that looks like for you. But that's about it. That's it. So yeah, if you want to join the research spotlight, links are all in the bio. Mentorship waitlist is in the bio. Follow me along on Instagram, reach out, let me know what you think about these episodes. Tell me if you go and cue your clients in a new way. I would love to hear how you're going with all of that. I also just love to hear anyone who treats women's health and how they do it and what they like talking about. So just reach out and connect. Don't be shy. I used to be shy connecting with people, and I don't want you to feel like that about me. So if you actually enjoy this, reach out, send me a message, and we can be friends. Anyway, I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are. Thanks again for being here. I really appreciate everyone who listens, comments, follows, joins my email list, whatever that might be. And I will see you or hear you, or I won't hear you, but you'll hear me in the next one. Bye.